Okay, we're here to discuss the question, who or what is Beowulf? The answer is twofold. One, Beowulf is the oldest and longest piece of literature we have in Old English. Um, the story predates its composition as a poem, it having existed, it appears, for a long time as an oral narrative, and the achievement of the Beowulf poet is very similar to Homer's achievement in the Iliad and the Odyssey, in that he takes a traditional story, one that would have been told by many, many shopes or bards over the years in the Anglo-Saxon communities in England, and composes a written version that survives as his own composition. The poet was clearly himself, we assume. We don't actually know the name of the author or even the title. We have entitled the poem Beowulf. The author provides no such information. But the Beowulf poet would have been an Anglo-Saxon, probably a monk in service to the church, because he has enough education to write and record the poem, and almost certainly, therefore, Christian. And so we see a Christian retelling of of an old story that that the poet would have been familiar with from his own people's pre-Christian history. Beowulf does not take place in England, despite our treating it in an English literature course. It takes place in Scandinavia, in what would have been Sweden and Denmark. The primary action takes place in Denmark, and here's a brief summary of what happens. We hear about the kings of Denmark who formed the tribe and the community in which the main action will take place, starting with Shield Schaefling, who is the founder of the dynasty, and moving down to Hrothgar, the current king of the Danes, the Spear Danes, as the poem calls them. And he builds a great mead hall. He wants to build the greatest mead hall in the world. And the mead hall would have been a primitive bar, a place for the warriors and lords, the liegemen of a king or a local warlord, to gather and to celebrate. They would eat there, they would come there after battles. The idea of the Norse Valhalla in Asgard is based on these mead halls that the Norse tribes and northern Germanic tribes had in their own society. So heaven for a warrior was a giant mead hall that you could live in forever. And you would go out by day and fight and kill each other, and then you'd be healed and healthy again by night, and you could go party in the mead hall. In any case, Hrothgar builds this mead hall, which he names Heorot. And the Danes move in and they do what they'd planned to do. They begin to hold celebrations there, parties, and to make a lot of noise. A whole bunch of drunken warriors are making a lot of noise. And ironically, this noise gets them in trouble. Grendel, a very angry and surly neighbor who is a monster that the poet calls a descendant of Cain, is kept awake by the noise and angered by it, and he comes to Heorot to take revenge and begins murdering the people there. And eventually Hrothgar has to give up Heorot because he can't defeat Grendel, and every time they try to stay in the mead hall over the evening, Grendel shows up and murders whoever's there. At this point, we're introduced first to our protagonist. He's presented first namelessly as simply a warrior, the leader of a group of warriors that have come from Sweden, from a tribe called the Geats, that have heard about Hrothgar's Grendel problem and are coming to solve it for him. Beowulf is his name, and so Beowulf, in addition to being the poem and story itself, is the name of the protagonist, a Swedish hero of tremendous personal strength and of royal lineage who comes to save Hrothgar from this monster. Beowulf does, in fact, fight Grendel, and he lives. And after the party to celebrate Grendel's death, as they are sleeping in the mead hall, Grendel's mother shows up and kills somebody. So then Beowulf has to track her down and fight her. Following a second party celebrating the death of the monsters, Beowulf returns home, where he delivers a report to his own lord, his uncle, Hygelac, leader of the Geats, and he then we have a short interlude where we are told that after Hygelac died, Beowulf served as regent to his son, and then later, after Beowulf's cousin dies, Beowulf is next in line for the throne and becomes the Lord of the Geats himself and rules well as a great king. He's a heroic warrior. He wins battles. He gives treasure to his lords. He provides protection to his people. He is the embodiment of a great ruler according to Anglo-Saxon values. Eventually, though, a third monster is brought out. Someone goes in and finds this big pile of gold hoarded by a dragon and steals a cup, and this wakes up the dragon. And the dragon comes out and begins slaughtering everybody he can find. Beowulf decides that even though he's now an old man, after all, since the prime of his youth when he fought Grendel and his mother, he has reigned for 30 to 40 years, and that after the reign of his cousin, Hygelac's son. But he decides that he has to go out and face this monster. That's his duty to his people as Lord. And so he goes and he brings some of his warriors with them and he tells them to wait. He's going to face the dragon alone first, but they're supposed to wait and help him if he needs it. Most of them see the dragon and run, leaving only one, Wulfgar, who watches his lord for a while and then says, I know I promised to let him face him alone, but I can't just let him die. Beowulf is clearly not going to win on his own. And so Wulfgar shows up and does just enough to allow Beowulf to kill the dragon, but Beowulf dies of his wounds. The poem is very simple in narrative compared to classical epics like the Iliad or the Odyssey, which is not to say it is lesser, it's just different. We have a tendency, because of the dominance in our cultural tradition of Greece and Rome, to take the terms for whatever we found there first, whether those poems are older or not, and to use them for everything else. So we call Beowulf an epic. And in the general sense that it is a narrative poem about a hero and celebrates a culture's values, I suppose it is. But it has a lot less in common with the Iliad and the Odyssey than one might think. Tolkien argues, in fact, that Beowulf is an elegy, and in the notes I detail why I agree with him. I think we don't have so much a narrative hero story here as we do a long account of the nature of human life, which inevitably, especially in Norse and Germanic legend, is suffering, struggle against great forces that we can't control, and in the end, death. Every man meets his weird. Remember, in northern myth, even the gods would someday face Ragnarok, and Ragnarok would lead to their destruction. There would be rebirth, but the gods in their order would pass. So while there is no mention of Norse deities or other pagan deities, and the heroes sound like they're monotheists, even though there's no New Testament references or references to Jehovah. So clearly we have a Christian author who his heroes are monotheists, but he talks about sacrifices falling into idolatry because they don't know any better and they sacrifice to pagan gods or to the devil to try to get Grendel removed. Even so, we have an echoing of the Norse theme of the futility of materialism and the importance of action in this life, and that all people die, and that it is that death that gives meaning and heroism to life, tied to the Christian idea that this life is meant to be endured, suffered through, and endured well, faced with courage, because the important things happen later. Both of these, to a certain extent, represent a rejection of of this world and what it has to offer, and find the ultimate courage and strength in admitting that death comes and that meaning is found because of that. In the Christian case, beyond death; in the traditional Germanic heroic case, because it is death that makes life so fleeting and so valuable. Um, so the notes provide a little bit more about this, and then you have the quiz over these introductions, and then next week we look at Beowulf itself. I hope you'll take a second. I found a video that contains a small portion of a performance of Beowulf with subtitles, but in the actual Old English, and with our best guess as to what that would have been like.